before I begin, मैं एक चीज़ कहना चाहता हूँ कि मैं इतनी अच्छी हिंदी नहीं बोलता हूँ, मद्रास का हूँ वैसे, बट अगर आप क्वेश्चन अगर हिंदी में पूछना चाहेंगे तो प्लीज़ फील फ्री टू डू सो. मतलब प्लीज़ डोंट होल्ड बैक. So there are two rules I follow, and I hope you as teachers will follow and try and convey that to students. Even as I say it, I stand in front of my friend, I hesitate to say it here. But you should encourage your students that no question is a bad question. I'm distinguishing between question and comment. No question is a bad question. I really think that this is something that you should encourage in your students, and I would like you also to do that. Second is that please don't feel inhibited because you think that your English is not good enough or whatever. Feel free, whether in English, whether in Hindi, whether in Tamil, whether in Malayalam. I'll get some translation done. Lots of Malayalis here. But please don't hold back because you feel shy about asking questions. And by the time we finish, I would like all of you. I think there should be equality, not inequality of question asking. But there should be. I think all of you should ask questions. That would make me feel very happy. Yeah. So, having said that, we are now transitioning to a heavy module, fiscal policy. Now. If you look at the module, you will see it's going to be broken down into fiscal policy, fiscal rules, states' experience with the FRLs, briefly on the 14th Finance Commission, and a fairly substantial chunk on the GST. And again, the reason we have chosen this is not because I like fiscal policy more than I do other things, but because today, as we speak, these are all very topical issues. The NK Singh committee has given its report on the FRBM. I was a member of that committee. The GST, you saw the minister. I should actually have been there in that meeting, but I'm sacrificing it for all of you. I'm joking, of course. It's delightful to be here. And so these are all very topical issues, and that's why we've chosen fiscal policy as two modules. And so we have to, and also some of the material might be a little bit technical. So I think we have to be careful. And so I'm going to begin by again spreading myself a little bit and telling you what we mean by fiscal policy here. Now, remember, we're going to be talking about macro fiscal policy. So it is not about tax. We're going to do the GST later. It is not about social expenditures, which again we'll talk about later. So what is a good tax? What is a bad tax? What's a good way of spending money? What's a bad way of spending? Those are not things we're going to cover here. So it's not about tax or expenditure policies per se. It is about broader fiscal aggregates that have an impact on the macro economy. Fiscal policy can affect growth, fiscal policy can affect inflation, fiscal policy can have a very important effect on the current account deficit. So it's those macro variables, fiscal variables that affect macro policy is what we're going to be talking about. So just to make that a little bit specific, we're going to be talking about fiscal policy has a flow dimension and a stock dimension. I want everyone to be clear about the difference between flows and stocks. I take it that it's all clear. Flow is about, we're going to talk about deficits, and here I think it's important there are different kinds of, different definitions of deficit. I think there are at least three concepts of deficits that we should be aware of. The overall deficit, which is just total revenue minus total expenditure. We're going to talk about that. And then I'm going to explain later on also revenue and primary deficit. So those are things, those are the flow dimensions. And stock dimension, the impact or the evolution of government debt, or more broadly, other government the stock of liabilities. And here, I'm not going to be going into this in very great detail, but remember the liabilities of the government can be either explicit or they can be implicit. So by explicit liabilities, we mean what is the debt of the government, right? But there could also be hidden or contingent liabilities. For example, if the government at some point has to bail out its public sector banks because the banks are not doing well, that will come back to the account of the government. The government may have to issue bonds for recapitalizing the banks, so the stock of government liabilities will go up. Those are called contingent liabilities. They're not sure, but some contingencies, if the banks make losses and they don't have enough money, you'd have to. So there's another example of a contingent liability. So take the case, for example, the government promises to pay pensions to all of you in the distant future. But it's possible that some of these are not completely funded today. Under the NPS, for example, in principle, it's a fully funded scheme, but you can easily think of scenarios where the government's ability to meet them may not be full for all kinds of reasons, and therefore, I think that that could become a liability of the government. So when you think about stocks of government liabilities, they can be explicit, but they can also be implicit or future liabilities that we should always keep in mind when we think about the government's fiscal position. It's not just about deficits, it's about debt and other liabilities that from time to time can come to the accounts of the government. Okay, what are the objectives of fiscal policy? I think you can talk about many kinds of things. I think the fundamental one is it must maintain macroeconomic balance. Or to put it in a negative sense, I think fiscal policy should prevent imbalances from arising. Fiscal policy can contain inflation or not contain inflation. Fiscal policy can lead to current account deficits or not lead to current account deficits. That's the external position. Fiscal balances can lead to a debt being seen as unsustainable, and that creates problems of its own, macro instability. So that's something that, that's an objective of fiscal policy. More and more also we see that fiscal policy has a role to play in stabilizing the economy. So for example, if you look at what has happened, take the case where the global financial crisis happened, and GDP around the world, almost every country collapsed. So, and that creates problems, unemployment, social disruption. So does the government have a role to prevent that collapse by boosting demand into the economy? That's a very important role for fiscal policy. So that's called counter-cyclical stabilization, because when the cycle is down, economy is weak, government can come and prop up the economy and maintain something close to full employment for the economy. Another role for macro fiscal policy is this, how it can play a role in promoting private savings and investment. Remember that, again, it's easier to think of this in a negative context. If, for example, the government has a very high deficit, then, and for example, especially in India, where then government has preemptive access to savings. So because, let's say the banks have to buy government, finance the government deficit via the SLR, for example. So there's a certain amount of savings in the economy. If the government runs a deficit, that means it's saving, it's dissaving, it's spending more than it gets, it's dissaving, and it's financing that by using savings from households and from other sectors, which means that the private sector, which does investment, will have less savings to invest. So the government has a very important role by supporting private investment, by not taking away too much of the savings of the household and private sector. And a last objective that one can think of is that fiscal policy has a very important time dimension. Remember, even in a crude sense, supposing you run big deficits today At some point, you have to honor these deficits, which means that tomorrow you have to repay some of these deficits, repay some of the debt that you do. And therefore, if you want to repay debts tomorrow, you may have to raise taxes or reduce expenditures tomorrow. So there's no such thing as a free lunch in this business, because there is a kind of time dimension to this. Over some very long dimension, time dimension, governments have to spend within their means. So the more you spend today and borrow today, the more the impact it will have on future generations. And that's why it's called striving for intergenerational equity. That also is an objective of fiscal policy. Now, okay, here I'm going to confess something. This is something that, we've written 3 economic surveys. I've worked on the Indian economy for about 10 years, very closely. But in preparing for this survey, I think, Kapil and Rangeet have helped me here on this, that we have actually, I think, come up with, or I feel we've come up with some new findings about fiscal policy in India, which I had certainly in my 10 years not really thought of. So you are going to be privy to some hot off-the-shelf research that we've done. And of course, tomorrow someone will write saying, it's all nonsense, CEA doesn't know what he's talking about, but at least we will start the discussion going. So I'm going to give you 5 big fiscal facts about India. And I don't think it's ever been presented in this form before. Okay, fact number 1 is that if you look at the long, almost since 1970 or so, what you find is that in the first 20, 30 years of India's independence, basically we were growing at Hindu rates of growth, but we were also being very prudent fiscally. We didn't have a lot of spending and very high deficits. It turns out that the increase in spending and the move towards higher deficits kind of coincides with politics. I remember in India, politics was the monopoly of one party until about the mid-70s. After that, politics starts becoming more contestable. Then what you see is that associated with that, you see fiscal profligacy keeping in, you see more expenditures and more deficits, because then it becomes more politicized in some way, and therefore the pressure to spend, to be populist, to win over kind of sectional groups becomes very attractive. And so you find this pattern that prudence when there's political monopoly, profligacy once politics starts becoming contestable. Let me show you a slide on this. It's not quite, but essentially you can see that the spending starts rising here and the deficits start worsening here. And that's around, this is a point that I think also Atul Kohli, the Princeton political scientist, has kind of made, that spending, and so in some sense fiscal prudence, macroeconomic fiscal policy acquires a different color when the nature of politics changes. I think, yeah?
Actually, this is the last session we were talking about that early 80s we started our higher GDP growth rates. And when we are looking at the previous slide which you just showed, about the fiscal deficit and all, I mean, unless and until we go inside and see what is happening to the revenue deficit, how can we comment whether most of it was productive or not productive?
So we'll come to that. We'll talk about that. The kinds of deficit.
Connecting it to the politics, I think we are not very sure.
No, see, I don't think that in terms of spending a lot, you can do financial, you can do populism either through revenue spending or through capital spending also. So I think there it's not, after all, you can give contracts to your buddies and investment contracts to your buddies as a way of wooing them over. So in terms of profligacy, I don't think that's such an important distinction. So let me come to point number 2. Point number 2 is, this is I think, striking finding about India, is that if you look at the last 25, 30 years, we've had, I would say, kind of one major crisis, 1991, and one near crisis in 2013. Of course, there was also a mini crisis in 79-80. I won't go into that in any great detail, but certainly since about last 25 years, since 1991, we've had one major crisis and one near major crisis, 2013. It turns out that both those episodes were preceded by high and rising deficits. That's why I call that flow profligacy, i.e. becoming spending too much in the context, i.e. high and rising deficits. And let me show you that in a second. So these are the two. So this is the 1991 crisis, and this is the 2013 crisis. And you could see a big build-up in both central government and general government deficit by about 4 percentage points. And the mechanism in which, so this is not just a timing, there's also kind of causation a little bit going on, because what happened was that when we started spending rapidly here, the current account deficit deteriorated. Then we found out in 1991, we had very high current account deficits. We didn't have enough reserves to sustain our exchange rate or to repay our obligations. And therefore, we had a crisis, and the fiscal deficit played a role in that. Now, on the second crisis too, similarly in 2013, again, it was preceded by big splurge in the deficit, and that again led to the crisis. Again, in a similar mechanism, it led to external. So that second part, I want to take you through a little bit more carefully. What happens is that, see, the deficit starts declining here because of rapid growth, which means that you get a lot of revenues and the deficit starts coming down. So when growth takes off, tax revenues become very buoyant. So you get a lot of tax revenue and your deficit improves. So that's what happened. You see the dotted line, the central government deficit coming down. But what happened was that around 2004-05, we ramped up our expenditure programs because we were getting all this money, right? You said, oh, you have a lot of money, you can spend more. And then the global financial crisis hit. We undertook a very large stimulus. That's why, again, the deficit declines, deficit increases. And then we were very slow in withdrawing that. And that's why when the crisis happened in 2013, it was a combination of spending too much, which led to inflation, which led to a very weak external position. And the Federal Reserve said we're going to raise interest rates. 5 emerging market countries were affected, the fragile 5, and India was one of them. So in a sense, really fiscal policy is quite crucial to maintaining external stability and financial stability, because it can very easily lead to external crises and therefore to financial crisis. And fiscal policy has had a key role to play. So here's what, and this is so points 1 and 2 I think are relatively well known. They're not new, but I think it's again, if you think about the students, third year students doing this, I think to motivate fiscal policy with these 5 facts, and there are some puzzles which I'll come to, I think is a good way of getting their interest going in fiscal policy. Now, I said that financial crises are preceded by fiscal flow profligacy. So in a sense, financial crisis is a kind of a necessary condition for this. But it turns out there was one episode where deficits rose by as much as the 2 ones that I showed you, and yet we did not have a crisis. And this is the new and interesting finding here. So if you go here, we'll come to this in a second. This is the mystery, the dog that did not bark. It turns out that we had a similar, look at this increase and this increase and this increase, not very dissimilar, and yet this one did not lead to any big crisis. So that's a very interesting thing, which I would, when you go back, you should think more about it. I have one tentative explanation for why that's the case, but it's a really fascinating thing that I would like all of you, when you go back and teach your students, to think about this a little bit more. Just to give you a sneak preview of what I think was going on, it turns out that the two episodes which did lead to the crisis did see high oil prices, so that what happened was its high oil prices combined with fiscal too much spending led to a very bad impact on our current account deficit, whereas in this episode oil prices were relatively low, so we didn't get that, the spending doesn't lead to as big a current account deficit, and so we don't get the crisis. But that may not be the full explanation. I think this is something that you should all think about and get your students to think about more.
Can be connected to the prices also in the country. If it is not having much effect on the prices, then again in the external market, your competitiveness will not be affected much. So your exports will not be showing that negative effect in that.
Yeah, so remember two things. I think the question is, you should also look at the impact of fiscal deficit on prices, and I think that's a very fair point. But two things, remember, oil prices are not determined domestically. Oil prices are determined internationally, but it's true that fiscal deficits can affect inflation, especially in the way it's financed. For example, leading up to the 2013 crisis, the way the fiscal deficit kind of affected prices was also through high MSPs and a lot of spending on agricultural subsidies, which led to that. So that's, I think, so again, this is something that you should explore in richer detail. I'm trying to encapsulate everything in one. I mean, again, we could have 2, 3 lectures or 4 lectures when you teach on fiscal policy. Now, there is another new thing which we've unearthed in the context of this, and immodestly I'm going to call this the Subrahmanyam-Parar theory of Indian fiscal cycles. And Patidar is named after a couple. And this is something that I certainly hadn't spotted until I was preparing for these lectures. And let me tell you what that is. It's very interesting that, okay, so remember, this is in some ways it's a very interesting chart, in some ways it's a very difficult chart. So I need your attention to this. On the top, we're measuring stocks, so liabilities, debt. On the bottom, for the same period, we're measuring deficits. Okay, so we have here, what happens is that in the 91 leading up to the 91 crisis, this is center, this is states. So it's the states that are spending a lot, and the center that's spending a lot, and that leads to the 91 crisis. Then we have a period where things are fine, but then what we see in the next phase is that the center is fine, but the states are spending more. Then we come back leading up to the 2013 crisis. It's the center that's deficits are, and the states are fine. And then in the latest period after 2013-14, what we see is that in another way, the center is actually consolidating. The deficit is coming down, but the states are actually increasing their deficit. So what you see here, I don't know whether there's a kind of a systematic reason for this, but in some ways, we need to, maybe it's related. I don't know for sure. Maybe it's related, but you can see clearly that what's happening is that states do badly. So the center increases the deficit. States are fine. We have a crisis, and then so in the crisis that did not happen, what I just showed you. The other fact is that the increase in the deficit was more due to the states. That's the middle line I was talking about here. And maybe this is another possibility. Maybe, all the people who look at debt, they tend to maybe not focus enough on what the states are doing and focus too much on what the central government is doing, and maybe that's one reason why it doesn't get as much attention. So that's another hypothesis to consider. But these alternating cycles of fiscal profligacy, I think, is certainly worth 2 or 3 master's theses supervised by one of you. And if you have any, if you want us to help in that, couple here will help supervise these theses and do this. But it's a really fascinating aspect about Indian fiscal policy. So that is the 4th fact. Now the 5th fact, remember, I've spoken about all of these in terms of flows. Essentially, Indian crises and Indian problems have come about due to flow problems. India has never had a stock crisis. What is a stock crisis? I.e. a crisis in which both people who are holding government paper, it could be domestic, it could be international, they start thinking that the government will not be able to honor its debt obligation and that it will default on its debt. Now that is really a big problem. It's happened very recently with Greece. It's happened with a number of emerging markets where where investors, government debt holders have had profound doubts about the ability of the government to honor its obligations. Now, I want to say a couple of things here. I want to tell you a story. India on this is actually rock solid in that it's not that India doesn't have vulnerabilities. I.e. even India, when debts come down, debts go up. I think it can be, it can raise concerns, but there's never really been any serious doubt about the willingness or the ability of the government to honor its debt obligations. Let me give you one story here, and you will I've come across one part of the story, but I'll tell you a kind of a sequel to that. So, leading up to the 1991 crisis, there were all these doubts about whether the Indian government would be able to honor its debt obligations. Remember, the Indian government can also borrow from foreigners and issue dollar-denominated debt, right? So there were these serious, when we started running out of foreign exchange, we had all these obligations to honor, and investors said, we have doubts about your ability to pay. So guess what the Indian government did? It flew gold from its vaults in Bombay or Mumbai, flew it all the way to London just to reassure investors that we are not a banana republic government. We will do all that we can to honor our debt obligations. So gold was shipped out to, in fact, the Bank of England vault in England, in London, to reassure investors, and that had a lot of credibility. So India has acquired credibility. There's a small sequel to this story. And this, I don't know whether it's true or not. I was not here around that time. You should ask others. So apparently when this decision was made to send gold out, some clever bureaucrat said, sir, we have different kinds of gold. Good gold, we also have counterfeit gold, what we've impounded from all these smugglers. Let's ship that, let's kind of ship that. And then I'm told, to the eternal credit of the policymakers, they said, no, if we are sending gold, we send good gold, decent gold, honorable gold to honor our obligations, and none of this, counterfeit gold, impounded gold, smuggled gold. And so if this is true, it only reinforces my point that, we are a government that we take very seriously that we do not default on our debt obligations. By the way, just as a kind of aside, you should remember that governments can not honor their debt obligations in two ways. One is they can say, we won't pay debt, renegotiate, etc., etc. That's called explicit default. But governments can also implicitly kind of default in many ways, or in one way at least. Can someone say how? No, rollover, no, they have to roll, the investor has to roll it over for you. So that's not a, how do governments de facto, and so de jure you can reduce the debt obligation by saying, I don't pay. But de facto also you can reduce your debt obligation. Inflation, exactly. So there are also implicit ways of reducing your debt obligation. But I think in terms of legality, in terms of a perception, there is a difference between the two, and to explicitly default on your obligations is actually a much more serious crime in the eyes of investors than to take it away. And just to give you, so let me give you an example, just to give you the trajectory of debt in India. I hope we have one complete Yeah, so this is a trajectory of debt in India. As you can see, for the moment it's too complicated, but basically what you see is this. You see debt rising here, and then during a period of rapid growth, debt declining, and now again debt has started to rise again. In fact, the interesting thing is that during our period of most rapid growth was also our highest debt level. That's a kind of bit of a paradox that, so it's not as if, people, one reasonable argument is that debt can hold back growth, but certainly in the Indian case that, debt, our period of most rapid growth, the period between 2002 and 2011-12, we had actually very high debt to GDP ratios. So these are, I think, 5 big facts about debt. I think that are very, I think they're actually fascinating facts about Indian fiscal policy that, it certainly, when I think about this and this, I get very, very excited because, these are things that you don't normally see, these kinds of patterns perhaps everywhere in the world, but it's something that's really worth focusing on. Yeah, question?
Could you give a quick sense of the rupee versus dollar debt in this
See, I think that the question is, what about rupee debt and dollar debt? Now, remember, we're talking about government debt, right? The government does not have and has never had that much foreign currency denominated debt over the course of history. Am I correct? Yeah. So, in fact, since, in around the early 2000s, we started expanding the limits on how much the private sector could borrow from abroad, and we saw a big increase in private sector foreign currency denominated debt, but not government. So that's, I think, but that's a good question, yeah? Another question?
Yeah, so I was wondering on point number 1, when you said there are 2 parts to that question. One is that, is there any other country with multi-party democracy which has this kind of pattern? One, and second is that it almost seems that the parties, when they are out contesting each other, more competition, then it seems that they are treating their voters as customers, exactly like firms would do.
Yeah.
So that would have very heavy political economy implications. So yeah.
Yeah, so I think that I haven't actually looked at the patterns in other countries, but remember that while I think what I'm saying maybe has some merit and you need to investigate this further, there are always checks on this, right? It's not that you have an untrammeled, just because it becomes contestable, you can do whatever you want. For example, if you spend too much, you can get into a crisis, and that's bad for your, So there are all these implications, but as a first order fact, I think there is a tendency for, if politics becomes more contestable, then you basically you use all resources at your disposal, including government money, to further your political aims, and it's a kind of different version of what we see populism, right? Populism is a form of that. If you never win votes, maybe you wouldn't do that at all. So that's kind of, but the patterns in other countries are certainly, again, worth looking at. And again, excellent topic for research and follow-up with your students is something that all of you should think about.
Just a small
question, please.
Yeah. Actually, you said that during first 30 years after since 1950, more or less the fiscal policy was prudent. Isn't it that you are looking at the fiscal policy in isolation with respect to monetary policy? And okay, the things went well, but the governments, the government used to monetize.
So that's a very good question. So the question is, in talking about governments being fiscally, being macroeconomically prudent, I have only spoken about fiscal policy, and it is true that fiscal policy in the initial years used to be monetized much more than in the last 15, 20 years. So it's a very good question. So one response to that we will see later on, In fact, in the module day after, or tomorrow evening or day after, what you find is that there is a broader counterpart to what I'm saying, which is that inflation, which is what happens when you would kind of monetize your deficit, that actually behaves very well in the first whatever period, apart from the famine period where it's due to an external shock. But generally, even monetary policy and inflation have been reasonably stable and prudent in India until and I'll come to one episode, or the recent episode, where inflation got out of control, but that was not because we were monetizing our deficit, it was because of other things. But it's a very good question. I'm only a question. Yeah.
This debt to GDP ratio, if you see last 25 years, it is ranging from 50% to 80%.
Yeah.
What level is sustainable?
Yeah, we'll come to that. We're going to come to that when we talk about the FRBM. So the question was, what is a sustainable level of debt? And only if it's a absolutely pressing question that if you don't ask this, you will not be able to sleep tonight.
So this is particularly the growth rate and the debt service charge must be playing a role. If ROI is greater than your debt service charge, then this could be possible that high debt could also be leading to the growth.
Okay, so that leads me to my. Sorry, I'm not ignoring your question. I'm just going to come to it. Yeah.
So in the last phase, when we see that the debt to GDP ratio has gone down, but the deficit has gone up. So is this that there were more disinvestments, or what exactly has happened? Two, during this phase only, how ECB has responded to this scenario?
So here, my short answer, but I'm going to give you a more elaborate answer, is that essentially in this period, what happened was that even though the deficit went up, our growth rate was so rapid that actually the primary deficit behaved in a much better fashion. And I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to answer all these questions.
It's not primary deficit.
This is fiscal deficit.
This is
Fiscal deficit, yeah. So now I'm going to come to you, and I'll make an honest confession to you. This next slide that I'm going to show is a slide that I would like to put my towel over my head and say, oh my God, how do I explain this? Because it's not because of you, but it's a very challenging thing to explain from my part, but let's try and do that. So this is probably the only equation in all the modules I'm going to put, and you have to try and understand the intuition behind this. So debt dynamics, how do debt evolve? So small d is the debt to GDP ratio in time t, and small dt minus 1 is the debt to GDP ratio in the last period. So if that difference is positive, that means debt is rising. If that is 0, debt is stable. Okay? Now, it depends upon PD, the primary deficit, minus something, which is that something is going to be positive or negative depending upon whether the growth rate is greater than the interest rate or not. Okay? Now this is a very important, I'm only putting this down because in order to understand debt dynamics in India, you have to understand this. Firstly, what is the primary deficit? The primary deficit, so step by step, fiscal deficit is total revenue minus total expenditure. That's overall fiscal deficit. Revenue deficit is revenue minus current expenditure. That's revenue deficit. Primary deficit is revenue minus fiscal, that is, the primary deficit is revenue minus non-interest expenditure. So how much, so if you borrow, you can borrow to repay the primary deficit and to pay interest payments. So that's how you must look at the primary deficit. And what essentially this is saying is that if the left-hand side has to be 0, if this has to be 0, these two will have to be equal, and essentially the difference between the growth rate and the rate of interest must be equal to the primary deficit. Now, I mean, how many actually understand this or think they understand this?
I think
Okay, good. If you're understanding it, I have nothing to do, I'll move on, but I don't understand it very well myself, to be honest with you.
There is one thing which I still don't understand on the previous slide, that when fiscal deficit is going down.
So perfect, it's done. Yeah.
When we say that fiscal deficit has gone up, fiscal deficit has gone up, that will have to monetize with the borrowings.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the question is a good one. Essentially what's... Yeah. Essentially, I mean, I'll take you to the graph and explain this to you in more careful detail. So this is how, so essentially think of, you need to borrow to repay your primary deficit and your interest payments, but your interest payments as a share of GDP depends on the numerator, depends on the R, the rate of interest. So the numerator increases if R goes up, but because it's a share of GDP, if GDP goes up, your liability comes down. So essentially it's the balance between the R and G that's going to determine whether your deficit is going up or coming down, or your debt is going up or down. And here, this is again a complicated chart which I want to, yeah?
Sir, my hunch is that 1 plus G will not be there.
No, that I can guarantee you that 1 plus G will be there.
I teased this in the class,
Yeah.
so I kind of remember that 1 plus G will not be there.
I can guarantee you that 1 plus G will be there, and you can have a side conversation with that. But some people also say that DT should not. But this is, take it from me, this is in all the textbooks. That's not disputable. So the question, the more thing to understand is, how do we understand Indian debt dynamics in terms of this debt equation? So we see that there are broadly, so look at the dotted line. The dotted line is how debt evolves in India. Basically, you see 3 phases. In the first phase, broadly it goes up, it comes down, but basically it starts rising. We call that a period of deteriorating debt dynamics. Okay? Here, after a point, debt comes down dramatically, and then here it kind of stabilizes and starts rising slowly again. Now, to understand this in terms of the underlying debt equation, essentially you should look at here the yellow line, that's the primary deficit or primary balance, and the red line is the difference between the rate of growth and interest rate. So the question, so always, if the yellow line is above the red line, debt is going to decline. Essentially what's happening is that the red line says how is your interest payments changing as a share of GDP. The yellow line is saying how much is your primary deficit changing. So do you have to borrow to pay both these components, and it's the relative balance that determines this. Okay, so essentially whenever the yellow is above the red, so here it's above, so this is increasing. So here it's above, it's declining, and then this here is below, it's rising, and then you'll see that pattern again. Now, essentially, I think I want you to take away 2-3 things from this. One is that this massive reduction in the debt that we see is because our growth rate was much greater than the interest rate. So in a sense, our interest liability as a share of GDP started declining quite rapidly, and then that's the period of rapid growth, revenues increasing, and that's one big fact. The other thing to notice is that the yellow line, which is the primary balance, is pretty much flat. I mean, broadly over time. Now, the primary balance is really what the government controls. So if it wants to, although we talk about the fiscal deficit as what the government tries to control, the interest is pretty much outside the control of government. Do you know why? Because interest payments are interest rate times debt. Now, most of the debt has been historically acquired. So if you look at debt today, what the amount of debt is due to borrowing today and how much is because of all that you've borrowed in the past that is the bigger portion. Yeah. So what the government controls is really the primary balance, revenues and expenditures. It doesn't really control interest. And in India, broadly, the primary balance has been affected by two things. One is the price of oil, because when oil prices go up, our subsidies have gone up, both on the revenue side and the expenditure side. And the other time when the primary balance has changed is related to growth. So when growth picks up, revenue picks up. What you see here, remember this, this is the big increase in primary balance is because the growth rate went up, revenues go up, and the government position becomes very, solid and sound and robust. So takeaways from this very complicated chart, 2-3 takeaways. One is that essentially our debt dynamics have been determined by the difference between the rate of growth and the interest rate. And if you think about it, if you look at India's growth rate, and here, by the way, R and G are both in nominal terms. So India's growth rate today, let's say 7% real, let's say 3-4% nominal. So nominal GDP growth is about 11.5%. But our interest rate, how much the government pays on its borrowing, is more like 6.5-7%. No, nominal. Yeah, nominal is 7%. So if the growth rate is greater than the nominal interest rate, your debt is going to basically decline because our primary balance is pretty much stable. So that's the big takeaway, that our debt dynamics depends upon growth, depends upon oil, and hasn't that much been affected by government taking action to reduce expenditure or increasing revenues. I think that with the GST, of course, tax revenues will become more buoyant and maybe the primary balance will start. We do see, for example, under this government, we see that there's been an improvement in the primary balance because the government has been steadily reducing the deficit. Partly, again, it's due to oil prices, but partly also because it's been fiscally prudent. And so this debt dynamics is something. So bottom line is, India, most of the problems have arisen because our deficits have increased. We've not really had a problem with anyone doubting our ability to honor our debt obligations, not many stock problems. But we always have to be mindful about debt because of two reasons. One is the question that was asked, what is a safe level, what is not a safe level? And the other question is that, is debt rising or declining? Because if debt starts, it's not just the level of debt, but whether it's rising or declining, that also affects what people think about our fiscal position. So now, FRBM, I am going to go into this, spend about 15-20 minutes on this before we, yeah, one question.
Sir, this, the second slide talks about economic outcome, growth, inflation, and external balance. So keeping this in mind, R and G, if fiscal policy should be concentrating more on growth, I think that will be taking care of the...
Okay, so see, that's the question is whether fiscal policy should look after growth or look after the other objectives. I think obviously it has to look at everything, but and depends upon what time it is. All these come in, and we're going to do that in the context of when we talk about recent economic developments. We'll come to that in a second as well. So here is, why are we looking at fiscal rules? What is, we're doing it because the Indian government decided to set up a committee under Mr. N.K. Singh, former Revenue Secretary, former Expenditure Secretary as well, if I'm not wrong, and a 5-member committee was constituted to review India's FRBM and to see whether we needed to change the FRBM in any way or not. Now, so the question is, I'm going to come back to this in a second. Why? So FRL means fiscal responsibility legislation. Why should a country adopt rules? Why should it adopt rules? Why isn't it just enough to say, I'm doing fiscal policy? Why must you have rules? Why is the government saying, I will beforehand say, these are the rules and targets for fiscal policy? Why do you need that? Second, what should be the principles underlying those rules, and how should they be applied to India? Very topical, because in maybe over the next few months or weeks, the government will decide, so I'm going to take your input into what the government should say on this as we go along and discuss this. So why do countries have rules? Why not just say, you know, the United States, for example, just says we run fiscal policy. Now, the main argument is what's called a time inconsistency problem. And it relates a little bit to the question that was asked about contestability of politics. That essentially that governments will say they will behave themselves, but when it comes close to election time, for example, populism will take over and they will unleash spending and deficits in order to win elections. So in time period 1, they may say, very prudent, but time period 2, when the elections come, they say, they bust the budget in order to win votes, and then that has a cost to the country as a whole. So as to prevent themselves against that, a rule is a way of saying in advance, I promise today not to do something bad tomorrow to overcome this time inconsistency problem. So it is a pre-commitment device by the government to following good policy. And at this point, I have to show you this. Now, I was going to show you this, but this is a very non-Indian elitist way of presenting this. For those who've read Ulysses, the Greek myth, this you will maybe tomorrow you can tell me what this means. But we're in India. Why should we rely on Ulysses when we have our own Mahabharata to make a point? Yes? Yes. Yes? Yes? Yes. So Bharat Mata Zindabad kind of thing, right? And so we have this. This is Bhishma Pitama. Remember that his father falls in love. He wants to marry someone, but she is only willing to marry him if he can promise that her child by Bhishma's father will become the king. And the king can't promise that because he has Bhishma, who is the natural heir to the throne. So she goes to Bhishma and says, I want to marry your father, but only on condition that my son will become king. So Bhishma says, no problem. He makes a vow, right? He sacrifices and says, no problem. I promise that I will not take over the throne. The throne shall be yours. But here's where the time inconsistency problem comes in. She says, it's all very well for you to promise. If you have a child and a son, what's the worth of this promise? It's meaningless. So that's when he says, not only do I forsake the throne, but I promise that I will never get married. And that is the pre-commitment he makes to solving this problem. So a fiscal rule, I think it's got a bit too convoluted for this audience. The fiscal rule is a kind of pre-commitment device to do what Bhishma did. I will never marry. The fiscal rule is, I promise not to run high deficits when election time comes. A good example. Okay, I need a clap for me. I know you need a clap. Yeah, exactly. So that's why, but I would all of you like you to go and read up what the other one is. Well, it's interesting just to, we should be open to everything, right? We should, that's, a fiscal rule is a bit like that. But here's the dilemma, right? Here's the dilemma. And who makes the fiscal rule? It's the government itself. So who is there outside to, prevent the government from not honoring its promise? So the fundamental dilemma is this. So this is the thing, the pre-commitment rule is that, Lord, I will not do bad things, but not yet. But the point is that it's the sovereign that decides the rule, and it's the sovereign that has the choice to break that rule. So in that sense, a fiscal responsibility legislation, FRBM, always has this tension. The very guy who's taking the promise holds all the cards to be able to break it. And that's, in a sense, a fundamental dilemma of fiscal rules. But it's not as bad as that, because, you can do things like, you can promise to be more transparent. So, for example, sometimes governments kind of say, this is my revenue projection, and that's why I'm going to spend a lot. You can have, say, an independent body saying, aha, I don't buy your projections. You are not going to get so much revenue, therefore you should not spend so much. And so when you do the fiscal responsibility rule, you can build in some of these kind of quasi-checks on the government. They're not perfect, because finally the government can say, who are you? I'm the government, I know better, and so do that. And also I think that a fiscal rule also has to have, an escape clause. That is that, all these problems about governments, you want governments to follow rules that are set in advance, but there will always be circumstances when, things will change, and governments may legitimately have to deviate from those rules. So you need rules, not just for the rule, but you need rules for the exceptions to the rules. But that too you want to, so you don't want a government that says, oh, today there was a global financial crisis and I will, in order to cushion, I will spend a lot. Maybe you need some rules on that as well. So you need, therefore, rules for the rules and rules for the deviations, so that in a sense you can have a package that's both respects the sovereignty and the freedom of governments, but also legitimately gives them space to kind of depart from the rules if the circumstances so warrant. Yeah? So these are the key features. It turns out that after 1992, more and more countries around the world are adopting fiscal rules. Notice that on the left-hand side, how many emerging market countries are doing that. And as of, so on the left-hand side, these are fiscal responsibility legislations, explicit, and but basically the story is the same. All countries, or more and more countries, think it's worthwhile to adopt these rules, fiscal responsibility rules. So then the question is, why does India need an FRBM? Or why does it need to review its FRBM, as we are doing now? And so, I mean, this is kind of whatever. So remember that this thing about pre-commitment, we have done that to some extent on the monetary policy side, because we've said that government will not affect or influence monetary policy. We've created a monetary policy committee that will independently decide. I hope you've not been reading the newspapers recently. I hope you won't. Please don't read them. But of course, you know that the Monetary Policy Committee decides independently. So similarly, can we do this? Of course, remember the big difference between the two is that in the case of monetary policy, you've given it to someone else. You can't do very much. But in the case of fiscal policy, you write the rules and you can change the rules as well. So there's a tension in that. So these are not strictly the same. And then, of course, I think a very important reason to have an FRBM is that, remember, in India, fiscal policy is determined by the center and by the states. And I will show you later on that in terms of magnitudes of the deficit and borrowing, the states are becoming more and more important. It's almost 50-50 in terms of how much borrowing is done by the center and how much by the states. So if the government has to be a model, then it has to be prudent itself, because a central government cannot say, I will spend as much as I want and run as many deficits, but you, the states, have to do that. Yeah.
Is there any country which is
following FRNs and which is not having the legal difference between MPC and fiscal company?
Oh, you mean you have fiscal but not monetary policy?
Yeah.
It's a good question. We'll try and find out and get. I don't have a ready answer. That's a very good question.
Is it possible? Practically, is it possible?
No.
Monetary policy unification is there, but fiscal policy differences that may have created the problem. Like European Union also, we can look into European Union in the same way. Monetary unification is there.
No. See, in the European Union, they have rules on fiscal policy. It's called the Stability and Growth Pact. Of course, they've started, and they also have an independent central bank. So they have both. See, the United States, in some ways, I would say, it doesn't have fiscal rules in that sense. They were trying to do fiscal rules, but it's not a good. I don't have a good answer to that.
They do a lot of spending whenever there is a crisis. Subprime crisis, I mean.
No, so did the European Union. I mean, that's part of the deviation as well.
My question was more because you had shown some countries list that FRNs developed, less developed. So from that perspective, I was thinking that if this is not there, I don't think a country is going to have an FRN.
So, but it's a good question. We'll look into it. We'll look into it.
Sir, one more question, sir.
Yeah.
So this FRBM, when it started in 2003-4, immediately after 3-4 years of time, it was found that it was hardly get maintained.
Can we get to that? That's the next slide I'm going to show. So we had the FRBM, the first FRBM. How did that FRBM do? Exactly, you should be teaching this class. You're anticipating everything that we're going to do. So as you can see, the first phase of the FRBM is in pink. I don't know what you see from there. But you see that, the FRBM essentially had 2.5 targets. One for the fiscal deficit to go to 3% of GDP, and then the revenue deficit also to be eliminated.
Primary deficit was 1%. Originally.
No, there was no primary deficit, the revenue deficit. Eliminating the revenue deficit. Fiscal deficit, and there was also something on liabilities, which is too complicated. It's not important for our story. You see that basically in the first phase, people say FRBM successful. All the targets are met. But then in the second phase, FRBM is almost abandoned because we had to, after the global financial crisis, we had to spend more, and we decided to spend more, and basically we abandoned the FRBM. And then afterwards, we've basically been doing annual FRBMs, if I'm right, Kapil, right? Basically, we say the target will be whatever we choose the fiscal policy is going to be. And so in a sense, it's a beautiful example of the rule following the policy. Instead of the policy following the rule follows the policy. And so in a sense, you could argue, some people would say FRBM hasn't worked, but I think that's a bit unfair statement. I think there is a sense in which it worked, because the whole consciousness in India that fiscal prudence is important, I think the FRBM has played a role. And I can honestly say that even within government, when you have these discussions, there is the fact that there is an FRBM with a target is something that governments take very seriously. So it's not completely, even this experience, I think, should not be interpreted as FRBM's not working. I think it should be interpreted more as it worked, but up to a certain point, not completely. Okay, so why does India need to review the FRBM? See, I think that it needs to review the FRBM. I'm going to come to this in a second, but there is, I think, if you just step back, when India first did its FRBM around 2002, 2003, India was a very different country from what it is today. At that time, in 2002, we were, the boom hadn't happened. In fact, things were looking pretty bad then. Growth had declined, private investment had declined, and India was not the kind of rapidly growing economy. It was less open to the world. Capital flows were more restricted. There were tighter requirements on the banks to finance the deficit. So it was a very different world then, and it's a very different world Today, because India is now a much faster growing economy than it was 2002, it's opened up its economy. So there is a sense in which it is very natural to review the FRBM. One. Then it's also important to review the FRBM to learn from what happened in the first FRBM. And I would say that, and by the way, we've given you readings on this if you can read this. This is my note to the FRBM, but you should also read the response. I don't want to bias you in any way. First, remember that it failed in flow terms. I mean, it's exactly the chart that I showed you, that it could not prevent this from happening. And here, basically the crisis happened here. The FRBM was not able to prevent that dangerous rise in imbalance, which led to the crisis. So in that sense, you could argue that it failed to prevent a buildup of dangerous fiscal imbalances. And we know why that happened. When growth boomed, spending programs took off, and then we saw that after the crisis, we increased the deficit, and we reduced the deficit very slowly. And because of that combination of a ramp up in expenditure, big increase in deficit didn't come down, we had the crisis. The second, I think, a more kind of subtle problem is that, which I showed you, is that the FRBM in some ways has not succeeded to put the debt on a consistently declining trajectory. It's come down, but it started creeping up again. And basically, as I showed you, is an important point, the debt has gone up and down basically because of external factors. When growth goes up, our debt declines. When growth comes down, it goes up. Oil prices go up, our debt increases, oil prices come down. So I think we need kind of some ways of ensuring that these two big problems don't recur again in any way. And that's why the FRBM was there. What the FRBM said, what I said in response, who do you agree with, me or the FRBM committee, is something that we will discuss tomorrow, because now my throat is going. So although thank you very much for the applause, much more important is I hope made you think. I hope the materials were useful. I would like you to kind of go back and reflect upon them. And I would like you, most of all, to show up today and not sneakily take the train back to wherever you came from.
Tomorrow 10:30?
Yeah, tomorrow 10:30, yeah? We continue with this. Same place, same place. Huh? 10. Oh, sorry. Tomorrow's 10, because 10 to 12:30. Yeah. Good, no?